Merry Christmas, everyone. I don't know when you're watching this, but today is Christmas when I'm doing this video, and the subject matter will be Christmas. I wanted to explore why I believe the Gospels can be trusted in regards to what they say about the events of the Nativity, and I'm going to do it by addressing 3 criticisms that I got from another video that I watched that was essentially saying these 3 criticisms should be enough to put doubt into the heart of the Christian to whether they should even believe this stuff. So let's find out if that's true. I mean, are these 3 criticisms enough to cause you to doubt or not? So but before I delve into the 3 criticisms, I wanted to explain what I think the idea of letting you know what's at stake, I guess, to a certain degree, or what the meaning of Christmas, this story, really is, and what better way to do that than to use Scripture. So let me start with this. In this, the love of God was manifested toward us, that God has sent his only begotten Son into the world, that we might live through him. In this is love, not that we loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to be the propitiation for our sins. When the fullness of the time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. Great is the mystery of godliness. God was manifested in the flesh. So, was God manifested in the flesh? One of the main reasons why we believe he was the Gospels and what they say. That wasn't all. The Gospels represent a point in time of history, and this is what was recorded about events that took place during that time. And can they be trusted? So let's deal with the criticisms. So criticism number 1 was Herod the Great was actually dead at the time when Jesus was born. So the video that I watched, I don't remember whether they locked in on the date where they believed Jesus was to be born or would have been born. I thought they sort of implied it was at year 0 or whatever you call that, between BC and AD. Now, obviously, at some point, people thought that was exactly when he was born, because that's the reason why we have the calendar set that way. But I think for some time now, we've known that there was a little bit of an error there, and that he was born a little bit before that point. The standard understanding is that Jesus was born either in 3 or 2 BC. So, and if you remember the gospel account, Herod the Great was around. In fact, Herod was the one that met with the Magi. Herod was the one that sent his soldiers to Bethlehem to kill all the children 2 years and younger. So if Herod was dead, that's a huge error. And then for sure the Gospels really can't be trusted at that point. I mean, that's just logic. So you can see how pivotal this point would be for both sides. So why do the critics say Herod was dead? Well, they would point to Josephus, and Josephus gives us a lot of interesting information. He talks about when Herod died, that there was an eclipse, and he talks about the Passover and events that took place from that Passover to the point in which he died. At 4 BC, there was, in fact, an eclipse. Now, if Jesus was born in either 3 or 2 BC, that would be the problem, because then Herod would be dead already, and Jesus would have been born after. So, why do they say it's 4 BC? when, as it turns out, there was an eclipse in 1 BC. Now, if he died at this eclipse, then obviously that's not a problem. In fact, that would fit rather well, because that would put Herod right. That would fit perfectly, actually. So they lean 4 BC. Well, they don't lean 4 BC. To be quite honest with you, the video that I watched, I had to do this research on my own. They didn't volunteer this information. They just made it seem like 4 BC was the date, and there wasn't any question about it, which, as we'll see, that's at the very minimum disingenuous if they understood this information. And if they didn't understand this information, then they shouldn't be talking about it, because they're missing very basic stuff. So either they're being disingenuous, frankly bordering on dishonesty, to speak in this way without mentioning the possibility that Herod's death could very easily have been 1 BC. Or again, they're so ignorant of the information, which I'd rather doubt, that they shouldn't be speaking about it. Okay, so which date makes the most sense? So here's the issue with Josephus. Josephus locks in the timing based on the idea that when Herod Philip, his son, took over for him was the same time, and that seems reasonable. Here's the issue, though. The manuscripts before 1544 say it was 20 years based on the reign of Tiberius. Almost every manuscript pre-1544 says 22 years. Well, as you can see, that doesn't help, because you still have two choices, 4 BC or 1 BC. So if you go 20 years, the newer manuscripts, you're going to lean 4 BC. If you go to the older manuscripts, you're going to go 1 BC. So, I don't understand why. Actually, to be honest with you, this would be enough information for you to lean 1 BC, because the older manuscripts should be more, they're closer to the original source, which is typically how you do history. Closer to the original source, you would go with that. So it would seem to indicate that at some point, somebody either attempted to correct an error they thought existed that didn't exist, or there was just an actual scribal error, and they put 20 instead of 22, and that carried on in the copies of the manuscripts going forward. So, and here's the other information that you need to be aware of. So the eclipse that took place in 4 BC was a partial eclipse. The eclipse that takes place in 1 BC was a full eclipse. Josephus does not say partial. Now, that I would suggest that it implies a full eclipse just to say eclipse, but again, it's evidence that pushes toward a 1 BC and away from 4 BC. You could still say 4 BC, but again, the evidence is that direction. But here's the thing that really locks it in my opinion, as a 1 BC date. I said before that Josephus talks about the events that take place between that Herod actually, the things Herod does and accomplishes between the Passover of that year, whatever year it was, and that eclipse on which he died. They're just, and here's the thing, there's about 30 days that take place between the Passover of 4 BC and the partial eclipse of 4 BC. There just isn't enough time for Herod to have done all this stuff in 4 BC. But if you look at the 1 BC date, there's about 90 days, and that is enough time to do all these things. So, to me, if you're going to talk authoritatively about a date set by Josephus in regards to Herod's death, it should be 1 BC. But that doesn't fit the critic narrative of being against the Bible. And I say that because this is a pattern I've noticed. Atheists, you see, there's certain atheists that are famous for being against the Bible. I mean, they're famous for this. They've made a lot of money doing this. They've got an investment in this. If you were really just dealing with the information unbiasedly, this would have been in the video. It was not in the video, or at least I don't remember hearing this at all. So again, it's bordering on dishonesty, to be honest with you, if this is the way that you treat information. And because if you do it, again, they're just being overly biased at this point. So you got to be careful when you take information from people, and you need to do research on your own. So that's point one. Let's move on from there. Oh, the other thing I wanted to say too was in regards to, before we leave point one. So this is dealing with Josephus, and and to the point of bias, right? So Josephus says things that line up with the Bible, but the critics don't accept those things, or they accept some of them, but not all. So it seems to me that when Josephus lines up against the Bible, or seemingly lines up against the Bible, they're all over it. If he lines up with the Bible, they either accept it begrudgingly with a caveat, or they say, oh, some Christian inserted something. And I'm not saying that couldn't have happened. I'm just saying I noticed a pattern. So let's move on to point two. So the other issue that is brought up in regards to the Gospels and the narrative of the Nativity is the idea that there's a discrepancy in the genealogies that is very apparent. You know, unless you just bypass the genealogies, you're going to notice this problem. And this is a good time to point out a few things. First of all, there's only two Gospels that actually give us the Nativity. That's Matthew and Luke. So they both will give us a genealogy of Jesus. And this is important to point out. And this is something that oftentimes we don't think about. At least I don't think about it. I'm somebody that reads my Bible all the time. But until doing this study, I never really locked into my brain that there was such a stark difference in the way that the two gospel writers approached the biblical narrative. And it's actually very educational when you start to realize how both of these guys dealt with the information, because it implies a number of things. And the critics will go one direction with it, and I'll explain why I go a different way. And you can make up your own mind. But so basically, Matthew focuses on Joseph. Everybody, I think, remembers, you know, that Joseph finds out his wife is pregnant, and it ain't his baby, right? And so he has to be told by the angel, hey, chill out. You know, this is God doing this thing. And you need, you know, this is, you know, it's going to be tough or whatever. And, you know, obviously it would take seeing an angel to convince a guy of this information, right? You don't get that in Luke. That's only in Matthew. In fact, the Herod situation, the Magi, all of that is in Matthew. It's not in Luke. Luke never mentions this stuff. So there's a number of times, I don't remember how many times off, but Joseph gets the dream about going into Egypt after the Magi arrive. That's also Matthew. All of this is one narrative from Matthew. Now, when we think of the Nativity, we're often thinking of the scene that is usually artistically interpreted for us, where it's a stable and you have the Magi and the shepherds arriving at the same time. Well, if you read the two accounts, what you'll find is that the shepherds are not mentioned in Matthew. The Magi are not mentioned in Luke. And it seems to be pretty clear that they show up at different times. So we've merged them together symbolically, but that's not likely at all. But in regards to the genealogies, it's important to point this out that both take a totally different perspective. And Luke's perspective is actually Mary's perspective. We get Gabriel meeting and speaking to Mary. We don't get that in Matthew. And it's interesting because he's in the mode of explaining Gabriel's appearances, but he never talks about when it's done in regards to Mary. And Luke explains what was said, what Gabriel said to Mary, what Mary said to Gabriel, and it also explains what Mary did when she met with Elizabeth. This is not given to us in Matthew, this is only given to us in Luke. So, here's what you're seeing. Matthew is giving us Joseph and the Judean community's perspective. Matthew was a Jewish tax collector, and this seems very reasonable. Luke was a Gentile, as best we know, companion of Paul, who interviewed people. In fact, the beginning of Luke explains that he basically compiles all these sources. It must be the case, if Luke's to be believed, that one of his sources is Mary. Who else could have given him all this information? And I said all that to say this. The standard way that the Christian explains the differences in regards to the genealogy is this. Matthew is giving you the community view of Jesus's line. So Jesus's father was this, whose father was this, whose father was that, and on up. And Matthew is also trying to get Jews to understand that this, in fact, is the son of David, the royal line of David. So he's tracing Joseph all the way up to Solomon. That's what he's doing, okay? Whereas Luke is explaining things, again, he's getting his information from Mary. So he's going through Mary's line because we need to know who Jesus was as a man. This is still a human who made up his blood. Remember, Joseph had no genetic link to Jesus. He was not his real father in that way. So who made up the human package of Jesus? That's what Luke is explaining to us. And Luke goes from Mary's line through Nathan, up to Nathan to David. So both Mary and Joseph are descendants of David. One comes via Nathan, the other comes via Solomon. And it's interesting if this is true, and I say if just because you want to take the unbiased view of these things, right? Because what happens is that you realize that, for one, the gospel narrative, or the biblical narrative is that sin is the sin of Adam, and it travels through the man. It does not travel through the woman. All sin comes through man. That's why we can say Jesus is sinless, because he's the one guy who was born without this sin being attached to him that comes via the man. So, that being said, one of the other issues that needs to be pointed out is, I think it's Jeremiah 22:30. Don't quote me on that, but that might, somewhere around there. There is a curse that's put on the royal line of David. Well, if you have the sin nature and you have this royal curse coming through the line, then it's important that Joseph didn't pass this on to Jesus. And especially when you watch a video or when you hear an Orthodox Jew say, well, Jesus, being very critical of the gospel and the genealogies, I'd just like to ask, if you're waiting for the son of David, how do you get around the curse? Because you're waiting for King David, the next King David. But yet there was a curse on the line, right? Now, I'm sure they've got it. They've got something to say about this. I'm not positive what it is. I guarantee they've got some reason this doesn't apply or whatever. But in the Christian mind, it's there. It's Jeremiah 22:30, I think, and it's very clear. And historically, it's very clear. I mean, there has not been a. So, if that's the case, we've got Israel now. Where's the king? You know, the curse is still in effect as far as we're concerned. So that's a big obstacle if you're an Orthodox Jew and you want to say, well, Jesus ain't the Messiah. Well, let me tell you why Jesus is the Messiah, because Jesus doesn't have that problem, because he was virgin born. He doesn't have that sin nature and he doesn't have that royal curse. He still has the titleship without that genetic defect coming along with it. And that's why the genealogies are important, and that's why they're spelled out the way that they are. And that's a very valid, extremely valid way to look at what the Gospels are saying. And it's completely in context with the way both of the Gospel writers explain who their audience is and who they are as people and what the whole purpose of the Gospels was. So that's point 2. So point 3. Point 3 is probably the one that I would give the most credence to. Okay, so point 3 has to do with when you take both of the things that take place in the narrative up until basically in the childhood portion of Jesus's life, which is very small part of amount devoted to this point, but you can see how somebody, if they want to be very critical, they can have a point. Now I'll explain what that point would be. So again, I've explained how Matthew focused on Joseph and the Judean community view, and Luke was focused more on Mary's perspective, and he's basically writing his gospel to a guy named Theophilus, who everybody assumes is a Gentile, and he's explaining what happened, essentially. So he has a specific Gentile audience in mind. And so he's explaining certain things. Now, here's something that needs to be pointed out, because the critics would say, and this to me well, let me just say what they say. So they say that Matthew and Luke are liars, that they contrived this not completely false narrative, but they probably took a real situation and for some unknown reason, they usually don't try to get into motive, they lied. They explained, they just lied. They created stuff that just wasn't true. And the problem is that now we see it because Luke and Matthew were completely unaware that each other was writing a gospel. So the reason why this is honestly ridiculous in my mind is because, for one, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the synoptic gospels because they share information. So when your main point is to say that you can tell it's contrived because they didn't share information, that's like, to me, that's cake and eat it too. Whenever it matches, they just copied. Whenever it doesn't match, they didn't conspire correctly. They weren't aware of each other's lies, this sort of thing. Here's the thing about the way the gospel timeline is. Today, everybody says Mark was written first, and maybe it was, I don't know. But Matthew is first in the way it appears in our New Testament, because previous to this new understanding about Mark being written first, everybody, or most people, thought Matthew was written first. Also, it's important to note that Matthew, many experts look at Matthew and they say at least portions of Matthew come from another Aramaic version of Matthew. that there's an older Aramaic version of Matthew. To me, this points to Matthew being first and not Mark. And the only reason why we say Mark is because it just happens to be the oldest. Like, the copy that we have of Mark is the oldest. It doesn't mean there weren't other copies older that were Matthew. I mean, I don't know how this misses everybody, but this apparently does. But fine, it doesn't matter. The issue to me, first of all, is that Matthew and Mark came before Luke, and nobody even argues this. So to sit there and assume that Luke had no clue that Matthew even wrote a gospel is a great assumption. And you're building your assumption that Luke was lying, and you're linking it to this other assumption that Luke had no clue that Matthew wrote a gospel. So even in the beginning of Luke, when he's talking, the introduction that he gives to Theophilus, he talks about this basically being in addition to things he already knows. So the idea that not only is Luke saying that, not only does he tell you there that he understands stuff's already been written, he's implying most people do. So the idea that we would go, oh, Luke just didn't know, is patently absurd. And here's the other thing, just from a complete breakdown of logic, if this is the case, let's assume Luke was completely oblivious to Matthew's gospel. He never explains Joseph and why Joseph's completely fine carrying Mary on a donkey to Bethlehem when she's carrying some other dude's child. Don't you think this is pertinent to introducing your audience to some very crucial information? He never mentions it. The only reason could possibly be in a normal world is he knows everybody's already aware. He already understands, everybody knows Joseph's side. That Joseph saw an angel. That's the whole, of course this is what it was. And so that's important to understand, because if Luke's going to create a lie, why would he make blatant errors when he had Matthew to look at? So this is extremely important to understand. To assume they didn't understand or didn't know about each other in order to justify your other assumption that's not good argumentation at all. And so here's the critical thing, right? So Luke says that once Jesus is born, 8 days later they go up to the temple. No, I'm sorry. 8 days later he's circumcised. And then after the period of, I don't know, I forget what it's called, but there's a period of time where after the woman and the child have birth, they're basically, the woman gives birth to a child, they're unclean, right? After that time, they're supposed to go up to the temple for the dedication. And so he mentions the circumcision and then the time of the dedication. I don't remember, or I don't even know what the time is. I'm not going to look into the Old Testament to figure it out. I don't particularly care. It's probably a couple weeks or a month or 2 months or something to that effect. So they end up at the end of the time of when the purification is done. They go up to the temple for the dedication. That's where they meet Simeon. That's where they meet Anna. This is all recorded in Luke. After Luke talks about this and understands Simeon and Anna basically are giving prophetic utterances and saying, because they've been waiting for the Messiah, somehow, and the Holy Spirit explains to them, here he is. Okay, very simple. And this is the end of the narrative, the nativity narrative for Luke. And so that's what he's doing. He's ending it, right? And how does he end it? He basically says After this, they went to Nazareth. Okay. And then he begins to say that's where Jesus grew up. But once a year, they'd travel down to Jerusalem for Passover, I think. I don't remember exactly what it was. Probably Passover. So they moved back to Nazareth, and that's basically where he grew up. That's all Luke is saying, okay? If you just had Luke, though, and here's where the critics have a point. If you just had Luke, you'd get the impression, based on the way he phrased it, that they go immediately from the temple and they go to move back to Nazareth. Now, the problem is that when you read Matthew, again, I mentioned this before, that the Magi show up later in the account, okay? Here's something that you need to understand. When they go in Matthew to do the dedication, they do the dedication with 2 turtle doves, which indicates that they are poor. If that's the case, they probably don't have gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Okay? So that's another indication that the Magi have not arrived. And the reason why you know this to be relatively true is that when the Magi arrive, they go immediately from Jerusalem, having met with Herod, and go down to Bethlehem. It's 5 miles. You know, they're going to be there in a day or under. Once they find Jesus, they find him in a house, and they call him a child. They don't call him a baby. Okay? Also, when the Magi do not go back to Herod, Herod ends up sending the army out to kill every child that's 2 and under. So this gives you some indication of the time frame. Herod believes that Jesus is probably at least 1 at this point. Okay? So a number of months, a good number of months have taken place from the point in time when Jesus was born to when these Magi arrive. And so if you're just dealing with a couple of weeks or a month or 2 for the impurity portion, and then from the temple they go straight to Nazareth, it looks like a contradiction. Like they're in Bethlehem according to Matthew when they're actually in Nazareth according to Luke. Again, I've already alluded to this, but there's a couple ways to deal with it. First of all, it doesn't say immediately after this in Luke. It doesn't say that. Again, he's ending the nativity narrative, and he's explaining, he's bridging the next narrative, which is to say when they came back when he was 12 years old to Jerusalem. He's growing up in Nazareth, he's coming back as 12 years old, and he amazed everybody at the temple on one of these trips. So he just wanted to tell that portion of the story, and he's using that little section to bridge the Bethlehem nativity to the Nazareth back and forth to Jerusalem nativity or narrative. So that's not a problem in my mind. And even if you go, well, let's assume they went back to Nazareth, the other way around this is, and this is, I know it sounds like you got to get around something, but I mean, it's just, they're not, the Bible isn't exhaustive. It's not giving you every single itinerary and event that ever took place. So the idea that the gospel writers had to, felt it necessary to do this would only be to please people like critics who will never be pleased anyway. So the whole thing, the other way around this is simply one of these trips. If they travel to Jerusalem every year, Joseph is from Bethlehem, right? So it's completely likely that he would stay in Bethlehem when they were traveling to Jerusalem. And maybe when the Magi arrived was during one of these trips. So when the Magi come down to Bethlehem, they happen to be in the house of one of his relatives when they find him. They're still living in Nazareth. We don't know. So that's basically the gist of the 3 points. I would like to say too that, Luke says something that's criticized. He says the reason why Joseph and Mary had to travel to Bethlehem was the fact that there was a census that was done by Quirinius, or however you pronounce that guy's name, who was the governor of Syria. And it's often pointed out by critics that there's little information I'm sorry, there's zero, as far as I understand. I don't want to be disingenuous here, make a mistake that sounds disingenuous. There's no information that bolsters the claim that there was a census. Okay, but it does bear repeating in this case that, and I say repeating, not that I've said it in this video, but it's something you've heard before. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And it's important to, I think this is very true in this case. And the reason why I say that is, this is not the way liars talk. It's just not. If you have any interaction, any experience with interacting with people and people who lie, they don't give details like this. They just don't. Not only does Luke say that there was a census, he implies that this was one of a number of censuses that were done when Quirinius was governor. So he's doubling down on his lie then. And the fact, again, that we don't have evidence of this, it to me would be a mundane sort of point in history. And it would imply somehow that we have most of history. We don't. We just don't. We don't know. We have no clue about everything that happened in history. So this missing portion of time in history, it doesn't amount to really anything. It's a point. I mean, you can say, well, it's interesting we don't have this, and that's fine. It doesn't overturn the gospel narrative one bit. And again, this is not the way a liar talks. So the overall point is simply this, that, you take out of the Gospels what you want to take out of it. I've dealt with every criticism, and I'd be interested to see if anybody watches this, if they have maybe information I'm not aware of, an explanation that will shed some different perspective in a different direction than what I've already said about these things. Any argument that negates what I've said, because it seems plain to me, but I'm just a biased person looking at it from a skewed perspective like everybody else is. So I'd be interested in what your perspective is. What do you think about the narrative? Do you find the criticism compelling? Do you think the way that I've handled the criticism wasn't a valid, or didn't just basically, to me, it dismisses the criticism for the most part? So the Gospels stand the test of time. They have stood the test of time. And, if you don't believe, it's just because you don't want to believe. The evidence is there. Most people who don't believe, it's not that God is unbelievable. It's that they disagree with him. They don't like suffering. They don't like negative things that happen in the world. They wouldn't have done this. They wouldn't have done that. And they're bitter, and they're rebellious, and because of that taints the way they view the Gospels. And I say this honestly, I say this even to, so the video that I watched was an atheist, and that very much applies, but he was showing a video of an Orthodox Jew, and it still applies. An Orthodox Jew, they don't agree with Yahweh's Messiah. And that perspective skews how they view and deal with the evidence, in my opinion. So Christmas stands. Jesus was born. Jesus was born of a virgin. Jesus is the Messiah. He died for our sins. He came into this world exactly as history records, and no amount of second guessing or inserting doubts in the gaps not told to us negates any of that information, undoes any of those points of fact. And I'll leave you with another scripture. Because the children have partaken of flesh and blood, he likewise himself shared in the same, that through death he might destroy him who had the power of death, and that is the devil, so that those who all their lives have been held in slavery to the fear of death, would be made free.